The Battle of Eutaw Springs, fought on September 8, 1781, in present-day Orangeburg County, South Carolina, was one of the final major engagements of the American Revolutionary War in the Southern Theater. The battle marked the last significant attempt by British forces to retain control over the South, and it contributed to the ultimate British surrender at Yorktown a little over a month later. By 1781, the war in the northern colonies had largely stagnated, but the conflict in the southern colonies was fiercely contested. The British, under General Charles Cornwallis, sought to subdue the southern states, especially South Carolina, North Carolina, and Georgia, believing that strong loyalist support in these regions would help them regain control. However, American resistance, combined with partisan warfare led by figures like Francis Marion and Thomas Sumter, proved more tenacious than expected. The British had established a series of outposts in South Carolina to secure their control, one of which was at Eutaw Springs. General Nathaniel Greene, the American commander in the South, had been gradually weakening British forces in a series of engagements throughout 1781, including victories at Cowpens and Guilford Courthouse. His strategy was to draw British forces out of their strongholds, harass their supply lines, and wear them down through attrition. In early September, Greene learned that a British force of about 2,000 men, commanded by Colonel Alexander Stewart, was encamped at Eutaw Springs. Seeing an opportunity to strike, Greene, commanding roughly 2,000 to 100 troops, many of whom were state militia. The battle began early in the morning when Greene's forces advanced towards the British camp. The terrain was difficult, with dense woods and swampy areas around the Eutaw Creek and the Santee River. The Americans formed a line of battle, with militia in the front, Continental troops in the rear, and a small cavalry force. The initial American assault caught the British by surprise. The militia, often considered unreliable, performed admirably, holding their ground against British musket fire. Greene's regular Continental troops then advanced, pushing back the British forces with significant success. For a time, it appeared as though the Americans might win a decisive victory. The British were driven from their camp, and the Americans seized valuable supplies and artillery. However, in the heat of the moment, some American soldiers began looting the British camp, which disrupted their momentum and order. Seeing the Americans disorganized, Colonel Stewart rallied his forces. The British troops, including veterans of campaigns in the Caribbean, launched a fierce counterattack. A large part of this fighting occurred near a strong British position in a brick house or mansion, which provided them with cover and a vantage point. The British also took advantage of a thick, impenetrable thicket near the house, which gave them additional protection. The tide of battle shifted as British soldiers, supported by artillery and musket fire from the house, began to drive the Americans back. Despite the Americans' earlier successes, they were unable to dislodge the British from their defensive positions, and Greene ordered a tactical withdrawal. The Battle of Eutaw Springs was tactically inconclusive. The British technically held the field at the end of the day, but Stewart, fearing further attacks and his growing casualty list, began a retreat towards Charleston the next day, abandoning his position. The Americans suffered heavy casualties, with about 500 killed, wounded, or missing, while British losses were estimated at 600. Though the British held the field, they lost nearly a quarter of their force and were forced to pull back to Charleston, abandoning much of the South Carolina countryside to American forces. This battle, though not a clear victory for either side, demonstrated that British control over the southern colonies was crumbling. The Battle of Eutaw Springs was the last major engagement in the Carolinas, and it further weakened British influence in the region. Greene's campaign in the South had successfully undermined British operations, forcing them into defensive positions in coastal cities like Charleston and Savannah. This left the British unable to mount any further major offensives in the South. More importantly, the battle contributed to the broader collapse of British military operations in the colonies. Just over a month later, General Cornwallis would surrender his army at Yorktown, effectively ending large-scale hostilities in the American Revolution. The Battle of Eutaw Springs is remembered as a costly but crucial engagement in the Southern campaign of the Revolutionary War. Though technically a British victory, it was part of a broader American strategy of attrition that ultimately led to independence. Today, the battlefield at Eutaw Springs is a historic site, and there is a monument commemorating the soldiers